Hello, good evening.
Next, please.
Next, please. That's a joke. Jim Hall and I and Jill were old friends from Papua New Guinea days, and not being too modest, but Jim and I were pretty good tennis players, so we thought we were, and everybody that came along were, not up to our standard. So at the end of every match, we'd say, "Next, please. Who's coming up to try to beat us this time?" So we're still saying "Next, please" 50 years later. But all right.
I'm just getting ready to start the video when you're ready.
All right. Good on. Thanks, Phil.
You talk. That's okay.
This little video that I'd like to show you is bits and pieces put together. First of all, thank you very much for having me here, and it's lovely to see so many people. And it's at my age, 'cause my sort of life took me to some very interesting places around the world for the last 60 years or so, and meeting some incredible people and doing some interesting work.
Good evening, David, and welcome everybody.
And it all started in the Tasmanian bushfires in 1967 as a young man set out to cover those. But I'll get onto that later. But so it's nice to give a bit of history back of one's life. This here, my last 10 years of full-time work, I was invited to join SBS television to teach young Indigenous journalists on a program called Living Black. As you know, SBS is a multicultural network, and we're so lucky to have that, and the ABC, two public broadcasters, and the commercials in Australia. We're, for a population of only 27 million people. And after 50 years in the business, I think this was 40 years when this was put together, that's the managing director there. They made up some bits and pieces of my work up till then, and they put a party on for me at the New South Wales Art Gallery looking out over the Opera House, and I didn't know anything about it, and they ran this little piece. So it just sets up a lot of my early work that I'll talk about, like the Tasmanian bushfires, covering Vietnam for Four Corners, people like Mike Willisey, and so on, and then on I went. So if you want to have just a quick, Tony, just to have something to look at, you know what I'm about. I know that looks like all doom and gloom because they pick bits and pieces out of it, but a lot of those stories in their full length really help those people by aid programs. Care Australia, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, Oxfam, who I did a lot of volunteer work, just to remind people in wealthy countries what really goes on in the world. And I'm not a vulture, and you've got to be very careful what you use and what you do, but you try to get the balance there right, so people might just stop and think a little bit and how lucky a lot of us are. And that's what I always try to get with my work. But it all started with me. I did a cadetship in still photography. I went to school in Launceston at Grammar and Scotch College, and I was president of the Kodak Club at Scotch when I was 14. And being partially dyslexic, they thought I was maybe a little bit stupid. And I knew I wasn't stupid, but you get quite a lot of bullying by being dyslexic. I read 3 newspapers a day to this day, but when I was younger it was much more difficult. I had 2 great loves. One was to become an army officer and go to Duntroon, and the other was to work for Life magazine as a photojournalist. And the third thing was to work for Four Corners. Well, I never made Duntroon, I never made Life magazine, but I made Four Corners. And so I did a cadetship in photography, which is a very hard cadetship looking back on it. It was the best thing I ever did. And in 1966, I joined the ABC, which we were a very small operation here then. The 2 senior cinematographers, they were both on leave. Well, one was on a course in Sydney, and the other one was on leave. And so I was the young trainee, and I was sent out as the main person to film the bushfires on that Black Tuesday. And I went all over the place, it was a big deal. And I didn't realise how important what I was doing at the time, but as I said earlier, I felt very guilty of people's homes burning down. And I'd go, I was out here at Kampala, that's in Uganda, isn't it? Idi Amin, that's another story. But and I'd be out through there in Sorel and all around these places. And I remember going to a farmhouse, and the husband and wife were there, and the husband was up on the roof trying to get under the metal to get to the wood that was on fire, the timber. And his wife was down there with this little hose, no pressure, just the water coming out. And the house was burning down. And I felt very guilty, you know. I couldn't do much, but here I am filming this as a young, very young man. And so I used to put the camera down, and I rushed inside and helped drag out books and paintings, and just to make myself feel better. And when I picked up the camera and started filming, because I knew I had a job to do and it was important. I didn't realise at the time how important it would be. And I was with this lady, and her husband's still on the roof, and it was just a disaster. And a horse came around on fire. And I remember her saying to me, "David, you're not going to film that, are you?" or something. And I said, "No, I'm not going to film that." But that stuck with me. And then I went out all over the place, and I shot all this stuff. And then I had to get back to Hobart because there was a deadline to get the film processed, to get it to the editing department, cut for the 7 p.m. ABC News. But they wouldn't let me go through the causeway because all the police were there, because all the wind and all the flames and all this are coming over. And I said, in those days we used our own cars, and I had a brand new Toyota, I think it was a GT Toyota, gold, not shiny paint, that lovely metallic, is it? Whatever it is. And I was very proud of that car, and I said to the police, I said, "Look, I've got to get through." And they said, "All right, we're going to give you a wet towel." They worked it out, it would take me about a minute to get through, or a bit less, I think it was, to the other side. Wet towel, and I went for it and gunned it. And when I got through, because the oxygen out of the air, and I got out to check my car, and all the paint was all peeled and everything, and the bloody ABC wouldn't even compensate me for it. Very upsetting at the time. So I got that film back, and then this went on for 2 or 3 days, and when all that film I'd shot on that first day, we sent it to Sydney by a coaxial cable. We got on the roof of the ABC in Harrington Street, Sandy Bay Road, turned the dish around, and we sent it up there. And that film was picked up by Viz News, now Reuters Television, the world's most famous news agency, and sent all around the world. And that helped to bring expertise and aid, like fire people were coming in from America, from Britain, and supplies, they were bringing stuff in. And it made me realise good journalism, good filmmaking, good whatever, you can make a difference. The power of the camera. And that's what stuck with me still to this day. I've never made any money out of it because the work I do is not a business, and you don't make money, but it's the satisfaction of doing something which can be worthwhile to society, and that's why I loved working for aid agencies. So after that, to cut the story short, I went to Sydney to work on Four Corners, and that was some of the best early years of my life. I was still pretty young, and I worked with some of the great reporters there, like John Penlington, Mike Willisey. Mike and I became very close friends. He was a wonderful man, Mike. And I grew up I was an under officer in the cadets, a warrant officer. And that's what my love of the military, I suppose, in some ways. And I always wanted to go to Vietnam, because I was brought up at the time when people like Robert Menzies and Harold Holt, because of getting us into that Vietnam War, would forget whether we're liberal, Labor, or independent, or communist, or socialist, doesn't matter. They sort of lied to me of how horrible the North Vietnamese were, the enemy, the communists and all that. So that stuck with me. But I always wanted to go to Vietnam. And with 4 corners, instead of doing a news thing, we had time to do an hour-long or a 40-minute special to explain what was going on in this war. And I knew the second time I went there, we're never going to win this war, never, because I knew the determination of the Vietnamese. But we did some very good work there. We had the time on 4 corners to do deep stories, to look into what the war was really about. Not just guns going off, the effect on people, the effect on the American population. At the end of the war, the Americans lost 50,000 troops, 2 million Vietnamese died, we lost 530, plus all the problems mentally with conscripts who came back after the Vietnam War. And as we know, we haven't learned from that war. But in 1973, when I was based in Hong Kong, my colleague John Penlington and I, beautiful man John, we were lucky enough to get into North Vietnam, the so-called enemy. We're the only Westerners to go to the other side. And that was an eye-opener to me, because I realised they were just like us. They're just people, beautiful people. And I listened to all this garbage, how horrible they all were, politicians, a lot of them. And even the camera broke down, and there's the so-called enemy fixing my camera. And they put a buffet on for us, and it really opened my eyes up about people. There's got to be a better way than war. Well, as we know, there's not, or there doesn't seem to be. So after all that, then I went up to, a few years before independence, to Papua New Guinea, where I met my dear friends, next please, Jim and Jill Hall over here, who have stuck with me for all these years and are very loyal friends, and they're both beautiful people, and it's so lovely to meet you, Phil. We live next door to each other, and I said earlier, Jim and I were the top, in our own minds, the top tennis players, in our own minds, of course. So, and that was an interesting time to be there, and Jim and I went to do a television story. Simon Calme, what was he, Jim, a breakaway from the government or something, wasn't he?
No, he was in charge of the elections.
Yeah, but he set up his own private army, didn't he?
Pardon?
He set up his own private army.
Then he broke away and
He set up his own, do you remember him, Simon Calme? And we went down into the middle of, where was it, Jim? Can you remember? Yeah, and we went in there, and there he has his army there with wooden rifles, and we had to inspect this army, this crazy army, and they saluted us, and they're marching past with wooden rifles, and it was very bizarre, in the middle of Papua New Guinea. I can always remember that. But after all that, then after spending a lot of time in Vietnam, which obviously was a very important part of my life, I was then posted to New York to open up. Oh, before that, I went to Africa and spent 2 weeks with Idi Amin. Now, there's another story. Idi Amin was a real character. He's crazy, obviously, but also very charming. He's got his Victoria Cross from the British. He never got his rifles from Australia, all this stuff. But we're with him one day. He was holding a conference and he invited us to come along to film it. And he was getting all his money then from the Russians, or the Soviet Union it was then. And his private secretary introduced, or Your Excellency, the ambassador from Tasmania, the ambassador from Australia, the High Commissioner from here. Well, at the end, this man got up, this Russian, Your Excellency, I am the ambassador from the Soviet Union, and I haven't been introduced. And he's getting all his money from the Russians. This was a great mistake, his private secretary. The private secretary said, sorry, Your Excellency, sorry, typographical error. And Idi went for his pistol. He carried I thought he was going to shoot him. And then he calmed himself down and went like that, welcome. But that's the sort of Idi one of his generals was having an affair with one of Idi's wives, found out about it, got him killed and kept his head in the refrigerator and went talking to it. This is true stories, it's not just make-believe. So that's the sort of man that was, but that's a sideline. So then they wanted to open up a television operation in America. It was only radio before that, and there was Ray Martin, two of the best, who turned out to be two of the best television journalists we've produced in our country, I believe. They were two there, but they were mainly radio, and my executive producer, Peter Reid on Four Corners, knew they had great television ability. So he sent me over there to help set up a television operation. I really was only going to go for 3 years, and I stayed 10 years. But I was in the time when I got there that Jimmy Carter had just got the nod to be the Democratic candidate for the Democrats, to be their candidate for the President of the United States. You right, Jim? Next, please. And so I spent a year, and Jeff and I and Ray spent a year travelling around with Carter and the Republicans, of course. And Carter grew on me. He's one of the most, he's on my hero list, one of the most magnificent, intelligent people I've ever met. Not just, they used to joke about him that all he was a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. He graduated out of the Naval Academy, number 36, I think, out of 500 cadets out of the Naval Academy. He was a nuclear engineer on the first nuclear submarines. He was a very bright man. But what I loved about Jimmy Carter was his incredible honesty and his brains. He's very clever. He was trying to turn America around, try to cut back the military-industrial complex, which was taking over all these wars. And he really had a tremendous effect, and Jeff and Ray, but Jeff and I particularly, because we spent a lot of time with him. And I got to know him quite well, obviously you do. And his mother, Miss Lillian, his mother, they're a great southern family. They stopped slavery before it was slavery was legal, and they stopped having slaves. And really, it was against the law what they did. They were out, well, they stopped it for their place there. And Miss Lillian, when I first met her with Jeff, she was sitting at the railway station in Plains, Georgia, in a rocking chair with a badge on, Vote Jimmy Won. And I got talking to her, and she said, "Where are you from, David?" And I said, "Australia." "Oh, Australia, oh, yeah." Then I told her Tasmania. Well, no one, they'd never heard of Australia, let alone Tasmania, when I first went to the States. And used to sit and have a long, we used to go down quite a lot. And she said to me one day, "This is the mother of the upcoming President of the United States telling me her brother Billy, the other one, Billy's a brighter boy than Jimmy." Isn't that wonderful? This is Mum talking, only as mums could. Billy, he ran the service station. He read more books than Jimmy. This is the President of the United States. It's amazing stuff. So I spent 10 years in America, travelling to Central and South America. I went down to, I call it the Malvinas, the Falklands War with Argentina and Britain. I was there for all that. And also in Central America, places like El Salvador, Nicaragua, all those sort of things, which is very interesting to see that the CIA and these organisations were supporting the Contras and the crooked governments in Central America as it suited them. So I'll cut it short. After 10 years, I came back, and then I was posted for the ABC. I did a bit of freelance work when I came back, and I spent a lot of time in Africa for Médecins Sans Frontières and Doctors Oxfam, and I ran into some incredible people there. There's nothing worse than a refugee camp, but you meet these wonderful people the aid workers, school teachers and nurses are really my heroes, because they're not doing it for money, they're doing it because they really care. But I met a wonderful woman there called Eva Doherty. I called the story the Mother Teresa of Africa. She was looking after all these people who were suffering from AIDS and malaria in this refugee camp. And I remember we went into a little hut one day, and there's a mother in there with her 5 children, and the mother's face was out like this with an abscess. And she couldn't leave the children. There was no one to look after them, to walk to the hospital, which would take her 3 days. And Eva said, I said, what's wrong with her, Eva? And Eva said, David, I haven't even got an aspirin to give her. When that film went to air a few weeks later, we had hundreds of boxes of aspirin turning up, you know. So we got all that. So that's the sort of thing that it's the power of television. If it's used properly, the good things you can do with it. So after Africa and all that stuff in the Middle East and Asia, you talk about the Gaza Strip. Years ago, I walked the Gaza Strip, and I loved the people there. And they made the most out of what they had there. The Israelis were even cutting their swings off in the schools and all this stuff, and it was really, really horrible. And to see what's happened now is outrageous, I think. But there's a lot of politics involved, of course. So after doing all that, I went to Moscow during Gorbachev's time. Gorbachev is another one of my heroes. He's the man who allowed the Berlin Wall to come down. And he wanted to change the Soviet Union. He wanted to make... He realised before he became president of the Soviet Union, he was the agricultural minister. And he couldn't put up with every day there was something like 50,000 locomotive carriages broken down all over the Soviet Union and all the food rotting. And he decided we cannot go on like this. Communism is not working. And so by luck, somehow he became the president of the Soviet Union. And he and his wife, they were the most magnificent people. He was a delightful man. And then he tried to change, and he did. But what happened to him was, to change the economics, you've got to start again. And so bread went from 10 cents a loaf to $1 a loaf. So people started to turn against him. And that's eventually what cost. Then they brought a man like Yeltsin in, who was unfortunately a very bad drunk, who couldn't handle it all. And then he was very corrupt. And so he was going to go to the slammer. So he puts in, what's his name, who's there now? Putin. He puts Putin in under the guarantee, you won't put me in the slammer and I'll make you president. And there we are now, what's happened. That's how history goes, what's happened to Russia. But when I was based in Moscow, I was fortunate enough, because I had a special pass, because I was in the Soviet Union, I could get into East Berlin. When they were talking about the wall coming down, I went over to East Berlin. No one else was there but me, from the West, because you can't, only because I had that pass. There were a couple of other from Moscow came as well, right? A newspaper from the Independent and the New York Times, I think. They were the only ones there then. And Gorbachev allowed that wall to come down to unite Germany. And it was just an incredible thing to see, that wall coming down. And people... I had to go over to West Berlin during the day or the night to satellite my stories back to London, because that's the only satellite feed place. When I tried to get through the first time, they tried to stop me, all the paperwork. Eventually they let me go. But as the days went on, coming, because the whole thing was collapsing. But I talking to the mayor of East Berlin one day, and he came to me and said, no, before him, a couple of ladies in their 50s, crying. They said, sir, sound like Donald Trump, sir, have you got, they had some letters to write to their relatives, which they've never seen for years, 30, 40 years. Would you post these for me when I did and all that stuff? Then I met the East Berlin mayor, who I got on quite well with. And he said to me, the following Sunday, I'm walking across no man's land, which breaks up this East Bloc and the West Bloc, and I'm going to meet the West Berlin mayor for the first time. I said, can I walk with you? And he said, yes. So it was amazing. There he had a bottle of East German or Russian champagne, big bunch of flowers, big Russian overcoat. He starts to walk, and all the people are behind him from East Berlin. On the other side are all the people behind the West Berlin mayor. And as these two mayors got closer, this is the first time, this was the start of the breakup. They got close. I said to him, Mr. Mayor, how are you feeling? To the East Berlin. He said in beautiful English, David, I'm very nervous. But away they go, and they get closer and closer to these two mayors. And when they got there, they said, good afternoon, good afternoon. And they hugged each other, and then all the crowds just had their freedom. They just came in from both sides and hugged. And Gorbachev allowed that to happen, and it cost him his job. But that was a very interesting time to be there. So after that, all that, a couple of years in the Soviet Union, I came back, did some more freelance work for the, wasn't work, it was volunteer work for the aid agencies all over the place. And then I did a lot of work for Care Australia when Malcolm Fraser was the chairman, and his daughter Phoebe was she was a volunteer working for Care Australia, and Phoebe would come with me to Bangladesh, and it was very easy to get the stories on because it was the Prime Minister's daughter, doing all this stuff, and so I did all that, and I really enjoyed that work tremendously, and a lot of that stuff, even the dear old Darren Hinch had a program called Hinch, I think it was called, and he was the character, Darren, and I did some stuff. But one day in the office there, this is a funny little story, that one of his reporters, Emily Booker, she was married to David Hill, who was the head of the ABC. And David was playing around, and so she decided to leave him. And she was in the office, and she was crying. And Darren said, what's up, Emily? And she told him. He goes on air that night, and David was very proud of her, and he's watching her. Darren saying, breaking news, my report, Emily Booker is leaving her husband David Hill. He's watching it at home. He's watching it. And he rings up, what are you doing? She had the last laugh. But Darren, that was Darren Hinch. And the other thing he did, I don't know if you remember, when Mike Willisey at one stage, some of us remember, that he got drunk on air 2 nights, he was a bit drunk, and he was slurring. And when Mike used to have a few drinks in, he'd get the giggles. So he couldn't get the words out. He's giggling, and because he owned the program, Channel 9 couldn't do anything about it. He does it again the second night. What? And Darren Hinch, they hated each other. So Darren goes on and says, good evening, I'm Darren Hinch and I'm sober. Wonderful stuff. But so after that, David Hill wanted me to go to Hanoi, back to Hanoi, to North Vietnam, to set up a bureau there. And that was right, that's because I'd filmed General Zapp, you saw it in the film. He was the brains behind, he knocked the French off, got rid of the French out of Indochina, and he also got rid of the Americans. He won the war, he won the Vietnam War. General Zapp, he died at 101, and I got to meet him, which was, just to meet these incredible people. But, so I spent a couple of years in Hanoi, then I came back, I did a bit more freelancing, and then I was asked to go to SBS, as I said earlier, and it was the greatest 10 years, except for my time in Four Corners, I think, that I've had, because it was wonderful being there, teaching the Indigenous journalists and filmmakers, and doing all that, as well as roaming the world. I had the freedom to go around the world and do stories on unsung heroes. And some of the people, for instance, that I met, and got to know some of them quite well. Where is it here? People like Daniel Ellsberg. I don't know if any of you heard of Daniel Ellsberg from the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg was he was graduated out of Harvard University, #1 in economics. It was during the Vietnam War. He joined the State Department, and he was sent to Vietnam as a second lieutenant. As a platoon commander, a full lieutenant, yeah, 2-pinner lieutenant. And his job in Vietnam was to count how many Vietnamese had been killed and how many Americans had been killed, to send back to the Pentagon. Well, say 200 Americans had died, which they were dying, 200 every 3 or 4 days back in the day. he was told, no, don't make it 200, put it down at 50. And he had to lie, and he couldn't live with his conscience. He's one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met. So when he goes back to America, he's based out of the Pentagon, and what he did, he copied all the stuff that he sent, and the real stuff. Because the war, this is 1972, during Nixon. And he and his wife, Patricia, if he got caught doing this or something happened, he could have gone to jail for the rest of his life on treason charges. And he was a very, very... if he stayed in there, he could have been Secretary of State or anything. But he got all this stuff out, leaked it to the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's where the President's Men, the film, came from. And they ran it all, and by what he did... Well, Nixon was trying to get him up on treason. It was really hard. Broke into his psychiatrist's offices, and on it goes. It was only because of Watergate came along that saved Daniel from not going to. But he saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives, because that stopped the war by 2 years, by them releasing those papers with all the false deaths on it. That changed the American position on Vietnam, and they pulled out in '73. And by him doing that, that turned the American people against the war and stopped they pulled out in '73 and saved thousands, not just Americans, but Vietnamese life. It was a very brave thing to do. So I've done a couple of stories. He's dead now, but one of those really great Americans, just very everything about him. Another great person, of course, that I became very friendly with, and we used to say to each other, he was about 50 years old, Tom Uren. Again, forget whether we're Labor, Liberal or whatever we are. He was such an incredibly great Australian, Tom. When he used to march against the Vietnam War when it wasn't popular, Tom really had an effect on me. He said, I love you, Dave. And I said, I love you too, Tom. He's about 6'3" and a former boxer and everything else. He left school at 14 and he was a prisoner of war with the Japanese on the Burma Railway. And he said to me one day, comrade, he said, I'm going back to the railway for the last time on my own, not as a minister of the government, but as a... So I said, Tom, can I come with you? He said, yeah, of course you can. So I went with Tom and made this beautiful film of Tom going where he was bashed up and by the Japanese. And it was a very moving story on the great Tom Uren. I just want to find the list here just to... Sorry. I'll wrap up soon, I think it's good. I mentioned Eva Dowdy, she was the nurse in Africa. Helen Thomas, that probably doesn't mean a thing to us here. Helen Thomas was a White House correspondent for the UPI, the big wire service in America. She was at the White House since Harry Truman, all the way through to Obama. She died. She was still working there, but Nixon moved her from the front row to the back because she was asking too many difficult questions about why did we go to Iran and all that stuff. And I did this profile on her. By the way, there are 2 documentaries about my work up on ABC iView, if you're interested in seeing them. One's called David Brill on the Front Lines. The other one is David Brill Witness to History on ABC iView. That's enough public relations talk now. But Helen was this woman who was just we need a very powerful, strong media. And it's not, as we know, in America, they haven't got public broadcasting like we have here. Well, they have, but it's not the same thing. So Helen, I knew her from way back, and she knew all the presidents well, and they knew her. And so I go and do this story on her, and she's going down to West Virginia to give a talk to some very wealthy ladies at one of the golf clubs. And they were a bit snooty, these, very snooty, and Helen wasn't, and they're all very serious looking at her. And she gets up, she's 85 then, she gets up and she says, to liven them up, she says, "By the way, there's been rumours going around that I slept with Harry Truman. Not true. I wish it was John Kennedy." And that sort of broke everybody up, you know, ha, ha, ha. But these are the sort of interesting individuals. But now, Rowan Gillies, I don't know if you probably don't remember in that piece, he's the young Australian doctor who I was in the Congo with, in that piece on the Congo, where those people, that baby was died. Rowan Gillies was a young Australian doctor. He was head prefect of Sydney Grammar, captain of rugby, tennis, rowing, 6'2", both parents were doctors, and he was a good bloke. He was a good bloke, a terrific bloke. He was chosen to be the international president of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, at 35 years of age. First time they've ever had an Australian. It's normally a French person who runs. They're based out of Paris. And I heard about him. He came back to us, and he was based in Geneva. He came back to give a talk at Red Cross, so I went down from Sydney to see him to see if I could do a story with him. We got on well, so I met him in the Congo, and he did say to him, MSF, because it's within a $500 million or billion dollar operation. I mean, it's a big deal. But he said he'd only take the job as head of it if he could still work in the field as a surgeon. And they agreed. So I met up with him in the Congo, and I was with him for 3 weeks. A lot of the times in operating theatres and everything else. There's a serious war going on there. But he did something like 150 operations in those 3 weeks or so I was there. I went about machete cuts and rape victims coming in, and he was just a fabulous bloke. And it was, that was just a great Australian who really believed in what he was doing. All he really wanted to do at the end of it, he's back in Sydney, was to learn to be a proper plastic surgeon. He trained under Fiona Woods, the lady from Perth who helped all the victims up in Bali. And now he's got his own practice in Sydney. Mary Hutton is an Australian housewife in Perth. She saw how the beautiful bears in Cambodia were being killed the delicacies to send to the Chinese. They loved all this stuff. And the bar, yeah. And they'd kill all these beautiful, and these would go off as delicacies. And she saw a little piece on TV, and it broke her heart. And here she was in her 60s then, when she set this up, this huge, it's now huge, vets and specialists all running this huge big operation in Cambodia and in Laos, in Vientiane, to save these bears. And I thought, wow, So I went up and did this story. See, my point is you do meet these incredible individuals. That's kept me going all my life. If I can help to get them a bit of exposure and get a bit of help for them, that's what I've done. That's what I've tried to do all my life. Well, I was up there with her one day and I knew about this, and I had to be very delicate when I interviewed her. I said her son, who was going to take over, and he'd been training to do it for a few years, he walked out on the road in Phnom Penh and got run over and killed. And that was that with him. But she's handed it over now, but she started it off with nothing, just got it going to this wonderful thing. Another person who I met called Ilac Diaz. He's a Filipino. He was an actor, came from a very wealthy Filipino family. In the Philippines, in the shanty towns, there's no light. Even when they're cooking, there's no lights, there's no power, there's nothing. And so he decided to give away his acting, didn't care about all that. He invented a Coca-Cola, a plain clear one, or water bottles, drink bottles like this. Cut the top off or something, put some soda water or whatever and water into them, tie them up with a bit of sheeting, put them into the roof of the houses, half the bottle's down there, and the light reflects. So the kids can study during the day, mum can cook the food and see what she's doing, because they had light all of a sudden. I mean, just a great human spirit. Anybody ever heard of John Rodstead? John Rodstead won the Nobel Peace Prize for banning landmines, which is a big deal. He's one of the few Australians to win it. He's become a good friend of mine. John travelled around the world looking into all the landmines that have been left everywhere and cluster bombs, and set up this organisation to stop, and they banned cluster bombs. They got them banned. Another great friend of mine, Dean Semler, who won the Oscar for Dances with the Wolves. Do you remember that movie, Dances with the Wolves? He's gone on to be one of the world's great cinematographers. But a couple of years ago, I'll finish up in a minute. A couple of years ago, a woman I know who used to teach at Sorrel School, what's her first name? Sharp. Moya. Thank you. Her brother, Don, he runs this school in Cambodia. He left Tasmania, he went to England, met his wife there. She was a very highly regarded home designer. They went out to Cambodia, adopted a child, fell in love with Cambodia, and then through a very wealthy American, they set up this school called the Liger Academy, where they go, Cambodia lost half its population in the genocide. We're talking about 3 or 4 million people. It was only 7 million then. And so they loved Cambodia. So they got this very wealthy American. He put 20 million in, and they to educate a lot of the children who had no education. So they got the Cambodian teachers themselves, went all over Cambodia looking and finding the best and the brightest, with no education, by the way. They knew they were smart and bright, didn't speak English. Got this school going, put them in, right through to university level. No charge, no anything, all own campus. They've got them into Yale, Harvard, Oxford, Berkeley, some of the great universities in the world. Can't get them into Australia because we don't give full scholarships for some reason in Australia. And they've come back, and they're the most wonderful, educated people, smart. But this school gave them this. After a few years, the American didn't want to do it anymore. Fair enough, he'd been doing it for years. So the school was going to go bust. And I heard about it through Moya. And so I went up and did this story, just on my own bat. And I got it to air on the 7:30 report. People heard it, saw it, and now it's been refunded. So you can do some good things there like that. Now, just to finish up a little bit about a funny story. George Clooney and his father, Nick Clooney, this is my line is, I've slept in George Clooney's bed. And I have, but not with him, on my own. But, what happened, I want to do this story on the Clooneys because George and his father, Nick Clooney, who was a very famous journalist in America, they set up a charity to help the people in Darfur, which when I went there is one of the worst there's nothing worse than a refugee camp, I promise you. And I heard about them doing this, and I'd just come back from Sudan, Darfur, and so I wanted to do this story on the Clooneys doing this, not about George as an actor or anything like that. So over I go, and when I get to they live in this beautiful small town where George went to school, and his auntie, Rosemary Clooney, the singer. And Rosemary Clooney's still got a house there, and they've got this house on the waterfront, little one there where George stays. And they said, no, David, you're not going to stay in a hotel, you're going to stay in our little place where George stays, down on the water. So there was this huge big bedroom with a billiard table, a bed, a kitchen, right on the Mississippi there. And so my line is, I slept in George Clooney's bed. But I must say, the Clooneys were great people. And if I can just, do you want me to finish up now? If I could just finish up by saying, I've always been a very proud Tasmanian, and when I first went to Sydney, they always joked about having two heads. You get a bit sick of it, don't you? You get sick of it. those Australians didn't know much about Tasmania then, those Australians. And so they picked on me a bit about Tasmania two heads. I got sick of it. So I became the ambassador from Tasmania. People still call me the ambassador. And at the end of the Vietnam War, I was sent up to Laos. That was the next country to fall. And I knew a Laotian general who I'd known for a while, whose daughter was marrying into the royal family. So he invites me along to the wedding. I Saturday afternoon at the old French embassy on the Mekong River. I always carry a jacket, tie. So I go along, and there's beautiful music being played by a Laotian classical band, orchestra. But all around, the war's going on. Boom, Americans dropping bombs, boom, boom. But life goes on. And so in I go, and I'm sitting there, and this very tall, distinguished man says, "Hello." I said, "Oh, hello." He said, "Who are you?" I thought it's a bit rude. So I said, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "Well, who are you?" So I went up and shook his hand, and I said, "I am the Tasmanian ambassador." And he said, "Yes, I'm the Australian ambassador." And he was. And he was. So I was caught big time. But we became quite good friends. And another quick story about my loyalty to Tasmania. I was coming back from Edmonton in Canada after covering the Commonwealth Games back to New York, where I was based. 4-hour flight, I think it is, from Edmonton to New York. And I was in convict class, thank you ABC management, right down the back there. And they always thought I was English. So before we took off, the steward was talking to me and everything. He said, "Are you English, are you?" So I said, No. I said, "I'm Tasmanian." "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "I'm the Tasmanian ambassador." "Oh, really?" So we took off, get up into the 30,000 feet or so and head off. The chief steward comes and says, "Mr. Ambassador." I said, "Yes." He said, "We'd like to move you into first class." "Oh, thank you. I think I can do that." So I go up, leave all my stuff there. I go up to first class, sitting there, but there's only one other person in first class. And they wanted to take me over and introduce me. It was the Governor-General of Canada. And he would know there's no Tasmanian ambassador. And with all my carrying on, I've got a guilt complex, and I felt incredibly guilty then, and a con man. So I said, "Look, I think I better go." "Oh, no, you stay." I went back, sat in my chair, put the seatbelt on, didn't say another word all the way back to New York. But to finish up, well, thank you for hearing me out there, but the journalism and the work I've done over the years, and Adam's starting to do it now, is just it's so important, a free media. You imagine where we would be without, even with the ABC going through its problems, which it is, because of all the changes in technology and so forth and lack of money. We're so lucky to have the commercial networks and all the other stuff, plus the ABC and SBS, of a country of 27 million people, and we shouldn't forget that. As old Don Chipp said, it keeps the bastards honest, and I think it really does, and that's what my work's been more humanitarian work. It's not so much the political stuff. I've done a bit of that, but it's always been about the people that I've always cared about. And now and then you can make a difference, as they say. Thank you very much for hearing me out.